deep, your love is wide, and it covers us. Your love is fierce, your love is strong, it is furious. Your love is sweet, your love is wild, and it's waking hearts to life. Your love is deep, your love is wide, and it covers us. Your love is fierce, your love is strong, it is furious. Your love is sweet, your love is wild, and it's waking hearts to life. Yeah! Your love is deep, your love is wide, and it covers us. Your love is fierce, your love is strong, it is furious. Your love is sweet, your love is wild, and it's waking hearts to life.
In the beginning, you were singing, and in the end you'll still be singing over me. In this moment, right. Right beside me, and everywhere you're in the air that I breathe. You are endless ocean, a bottomless sea. You are endless ocean, bottomless sea. In my sin, you kept loving. There's no end to your forgiveness, mercy. Every moment you keep coming, waves of your affection keep washing over me. For you are endless ocean, bottomless sea. You are endless ocean, bottomless sea. You are endless ocean, bottomless sea. You are endless.
Good morning and welcome to Watershed. We're so glad that you are here, whether it's in person or outside. If you're outside, I hope you grabbed a warm cup of coffee or something and have a coat. It's a little cold. But we're glad you're here. If you're online, we want to say welcome and want you to have an opportunity to greet the other people who are online, say hi, maybe where you're logging in from, where you're hanging out today. And if you're in person here, we want to invite you, if you're willing and able, to stand this morning as we begin by singing together We're going to sing a new song this morning, and so feel free to let this song kind of wash over you a little bit this morning. 1, 2.
Let my soul rise up to meet you as the day rises to the sun. Let my soul rise up to meet you. Let thy patient kingdom come. When's the last time you felt steady in the chaos? Hear the sound when the seed falls to earth. Is it time to give up your destination? Slow me down, let love do its work. Let my soul rise up to meet you as the day rises to the sun. Let my soul rise up to meet you. Oh, let that patient kingdom come. As the trees and hummingbirds lead the chorus, they work so hard in their center so still. Is it time for a change in direction? Slow me down where I bend to your will. Let my soul rise up to meet you as the day rises to the sun. Let my soul rise up to meet you. Oh, let that patient kingdom come. Slow me down. Slow me down. Let love do its work. Let my soul rise up to meet you as the day rises to the sun. Let my soul rise up to meet you. Oh, let that patient kingdom come. Let that patient kingdom come. Let that patient kingdom come.
Thank you so much for being here this morning and for joining us in this space. And we've been saying for a while that it is and has been really important to figure out what togetherness means when we've all got masks on and much of our life has turned to maybe more of a digital space for good reason. But we're still trying to figure that out. And so one of the things that we've been trying to do in our Sunday morning gatherings is just give a little space for you to make eye contact and just pause and see the people around you. We're not ready yet for handshakes and hugs, but hopefully we're getting there. And in the meantime, we want to remember our humanity. Remember that we belong with people. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of space to do that now, and then we'll continue singing together.
as the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs for you. All my tears have been my fodder, day and night, my only food. Oh, my soul, you feel forgotten. Put your hope in Christ the one, as the deep longs for the water, so my soul longs to be home. Come thou fount of living water, to my heart to sing your name. Streams of trouble never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise, as the deep cries out for answers, as your waves crash over me. Let your goodness like a fetter bind my wandering heart to thee. In the night, your song is with me. Day by day, you hold me fast. Oh, my soul, hope is in Jesus, and you shall love your God at last. Come thou fount of living water, to my heart to sing your name. Streams of trouble never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise. Deep calls to deep, waves of unbelief, breakers crash and bring me fall to my knees. It goes on and on. Where is my God? My salvation is in you, for you are love. And deep calls to deep, waves of unbelief, breakers crash and bring me falling to my knees. It goes on and on. Where is my God? My salvation is in you. You are love. Come thou fount of living water, to my heart to sing your name. Streams of trouble never ceasing, call for songs. Come thou fount of living water, to my heart to sing your name. Streams of trouble never cease, praise and call for songs of loudest praise.
True story. We were you can be seated. Unless you feel like you need to stand while I'm talking, go ahead. You can do that. Oh, thank you, thank you. True story. A couple of weeks ago, we were at Petty Thieves. It was after church, and Mike and I were having a conversation. And I've known Mike for a couple of years, and he started telling me he does a beatbox thing, and I think he means like. And I looked at him like, oh, that's interesting. And he goes, no, literally a beatbox. And so now he's in band, and this is why they don't let me near the band, just for the record. So true story there. I'm so glad you're here this morning. You sounded great. Yeah. So a couple of things that I want to make you aware of this morning. By the way, my name's Matt. I'm one of the co-pastors. If you're brand new this morning, can you just give yourself permission to just soak it in? Just allow yourself to kind of be drawn to whatever it is stirs you. There's going to be a spectrum of conversations and things said today, and hopefully some of this will stir you deeply, raise really important questions. And there's actually a way for you to engage in a more in-depth fashion. As we move into 2022, there's an experience called Preface that we'll start talking more about here the last 6 weeks or so of the year. Would love to have you be a part of those 3-week conversations, and more on that as we move into the new year. If you download the Watershed app, you can actually go ahead and sign up for those today if you want to. In fact, it'd be a really good idea if you went ahead and downloaded that app to begin with, because so much of the questions you might have could get answered literally in the palm of your hand. So that's a shameless plug for our Watershed app. And then also 2 quick things, and then a third thing that's a little more lengthy this morning. The first thing is immediately following this gathering this morning is a time of memorial for Chuck Willingham. I mentioned this last weekend. We lost Chuck unexpectedly a week ago this Wednesday. And so if you could help us at the close of this morning by exiting a little bit more expediently as you move out, just kind of maybe hang out in the area outside the doors here this morning so we can set the room for that. From 11:30 to a little before noon, there's going to be some food and refreshments for people to mingle. If you want to stick around for that, you're more than welcome to, but we need some time to kind of set the room up. And then also last weekend, I stood up and I made this passionate plea for Thunklau Hoykip, his church, and some of the things that they're trying to do along the lines of bringing relief and life to parts of India involving oxygen tanks, helping people have enough air during the COVID crisis to either to have time to get to the hospital so that they can get treatment, to actually be able to breathe with some sense of a lowered anxiety while they're sick, or in some instances just provide them a little bit more time so that family members can come and say goodbye. It's a very specific ask that we made to the tune of about $8,000 so that we could address the oxygen needs, some hospital bills for Thunklau, and then annual salary. And I'm going to need a chiropractor after last weekend because we met that goal in a matter of about 24 hours. So thank you so much. Give yourselves a round of applause. That is buttoned up. We were anticipating talking about that for the next several weeks. And so, those of you who responded, there was a couple of you that responded in really spectacular fashion. And then a lot of people sort of gave to that experience. And we're really excited to have said, to be able to declare victory on that front, which is a little bit of a transitional moment for us. Scott, why don't you come on up for just a second? Scott and I have been talking, our staff have been talking, our lead team have been talking now for the last 2 years, really, but more specifically over the last several months. And probably the best way to get into this, and we're not going to spend a great deal of time this morning because we have a limited amount of time, but let me rewind the calendar for everyone and kind of bring everyone up to speed on what's been going on. So the pandemic, 21 months ago, when the pandemic hit, Watershed was sort of in this upswing, right? Like we had worked through some really important conversations as a community. People were starting to show up here. There was some traction. And then the pandemic hit. And like every other church in the United States, the longer the pandemic went, the giving piece, the generosity, the resources started to wane. Generally speaking, when people can't show up to a space, it becomes, at least for some folks, harder for their resources to continue to show up in that space. And so we started to see that. On top of that, and if you've been in Preface, you've actually heard us talk about this, some of the things that we started to center ourselves around, some of the voices, some of the solidarity that we was naming, some of the anti-racism, Black Lives Matter, the conversations that we were hosting also created some slippage. And what I mean by that is, for some folks, it was too much, and so they left. Some of you are here because those conversations were being included. Because in your previous religious experience, there wasn't anything being said. And so Watershed became a place that drew you. And so while that's been going on, while there has been this pandemic sort of absorbing our resources, some things were happening that were helping us sustain ourselves. And maybe you could address some of those things.
We, like any small business, we were able to apply for some of the PPP money that the government was giving out. So we got like $75,000 in that. That was huge for us during the pandemic. That was a big piece for us. We also had, because the building was not being used on Sundays, we had classrooms we were able to rent out. That gave us about another $75,000. So we saw $150,000 come in last year that sustained us through those who said, you know what, my giving is, they retracted their giving, but we were able to see funding some other ways. We entered this year with the hope that the pandemic was hopefully gently going away, whatever that means, right?
Until Delta reared its head.
That's right, that's right. But with the hope that it was going away, that people were gathering with vaccinations and with a different kind of confidence, good or bad, but they were nonetheless were gathering. So we saw that happen. For 17 years, we've seen the summer months always do this in terms of attendance and generosity. That's just always been the way it's played out. And always, for the last 16, 17 years, fall has been a time where we kind of recoup the fall or the summer slump. And we came into this fall optimistic that it would be a fall not unlike any other fall, where we would see the resources kind of pick back up. And so about 5, 6, 7 weeks ago, when we were hoping that was going to happen, it didn't. And so we began to become a little bit more aware of where we were sitting with certain things. And because the giving did not sort of elevate to where it typically does in the fall, we are right now at a $65,000 deficit, budget-wise, which is, for our community, that's a ton of money.
Yeah, so it's never been $65,000 in November.
Right, because what will happen is we might be down 15 or 20,000 this time of year, and then we do some year-end conversations, and you guys come around that beautifully, just like you did with Tunglal's generosity last week, and you respond to that, and we end the year in a solid fashion. You guys have told us for years and years and years, you got to talk to us when things are the way they are and they're not good, or when they're really good, whatever it is. So things are really a little bit stressful right now in that sense. And so we have some thoughts towards what that looks like in terms of healing it and solving it, because it is a problem that we do need to heal, not only in the immediate, but also for long term. So the immediate solution is, if we take that $65,000 and we cut it in about half, say $33,000. If we can raise $33,000 by year end, which is a lot of money, but if we can do this by year end, we feel like we can at least move into next year with cash flow in a solid space. But for some of you are saying, but listen, I don't want to give money to something that doesn't have a plan for going forward with a healthy sort of disposition. So our healthy disposition is this. Pre-COVID, we had a narrative that was really helpful for us, and we would say, all right, we were looking for a handful of families each month, household units, each month, that are saying, I'm in for $100 or more in generosity at a recurring level, which at a recurring level, from a compounding perspective, creates a lot of health for us long-term, months out. And so here's our request. At the immediate level, $33,000. That's audacious, but it's very doable. I know there are people here that have never been a part of generosity, but you've been a part of this community for several months or a couple of years, whatever it is. Now's the time in terms of the one time. In terms of recurring, what we're looking for are 5 households, 5 family units, household individuals that are saying, I'm in for $100 or more a month at a recurring level going forward. So we're halfway into November right now. Are there 5 households online, here in this space, that are going to hear it later on social media, that are saying, you know what, we're in for $100 more a month? That's helpful, but we're already halfway into November. So we got 5 families for November, and we got 5 families for December. So our goal is for 10 household units the rest of this year that says we're in for $100 or more a month at a recurring level. So we're kind of, I hope you're hearing this. There's kind of 2 narratives here. There's the one that says we need to raise a good portion of our deficit to be able to end the year solidly, $33,000. That's a lot of money. But then at a recurring level, for those to say, you know what, maybe you're already giving a little bit, and you say, you know what, I can bump it a little bit higher, or you're not giving at all, we welcome that. And let me say this as a caveat. If you can only do $10 a month, so be it. That's wonderful. That's helpful. As we aggregate those kinds of resources and generosity, it's a game changer.
So one other thing I want you to speak about, that there's internal things that we're working towards as well involving our space.
Oh, for sure.
And
Yeah.
like we're tightening our belts even more so than we have been.
Yeah.
We're going back and going, all right, what's the next wave of non-essential things that
Absolutely.
we're going to have to kind of let go of? But can you talk about the space and how that's continuing?
Yeah, so our goal for 2022 is to rent $100,000 worth of space in this building, and that it will not impact Sunday morning.
Yeah.
That's the plan. Right now, we're renting $75,000. So our goal is to get it to $100,000. We've got some very clear. I thought we had it buttoned up this week, but the jury's out right now with a tenant. But the point is, we're moving towards that, and we feel like that's going to be a huge piece of it. So as we look at going forward with a pandemic, you don't raise funds like you used to in the old days, right? You stand up and just everybody writes big old fat checks. It's a different day, and we're not in front of as many people on a Sunday. We used to be in front of 2 and 3 times this number any given Sunday. So when you put that out there, the response is much more reactive, not unlike what happened last week. Yeah. And so the hope is this: we know there are many, many of you who are brand new to this community. And you're jumping in, and you've benefited from the friends you've made and the relationships and the experience here. And so maybe this is the time for you to say, you know what, we're in. We're making our first overture now.
Well, and there's a reason that we're calling it sustain and grow, because there's something worth protecting here and
Sure.
stabilizing. There's a conversation, a theological, progressive conversation that we're starting to help shape, not just in the city, but we're anxious and excited and ambitious about how that might expand beyond just Charlotte and beyond the 4 walls of this community. There's a presence beyond the border of this nation in places like India that we're excited to be a part of. And then there's what happens in the actual interaction in relationships here. In an hour, I'm going to be standing in front of a group of people talking about the impact of one person in multiple lives, and people are going to be talking about the way that person has impacted them. This community, we're told by you, this is a special place. And it feels like we're just getting started, and there's a whole host of you that have come into this over the last 12 months, and now we're inviting you to be a part of a future that we get to create together. $33,000 is a lot of money. The O'Neills and the Hoferts are raising their hand going, we're in for the first 1,000, if that's helpful, because we're not going to ask our community to do something we're not willing to do ourselves. Again, I know there's a spectrum of what is possible for each person and each family, but would you at least consider it? Would you take some time today, over the next couple of days, next weekend and in the weeks ahead, there's going to be like more tangible ways for you to respond so that we can kind of track, all right, here's where we are in the progress, and we're going to keep you informed in the weeks ahead. This morning, if you wanted to go ahead and get started, you can do that through our Watershed app. There's real secure ways to do that. There's also real secure ways to do that on our website. Will you help us not just sustain what Watershed is right now, but help us grow into 2022?
And feel free to talk to us at the end of the service. We'll be in the back. My email, scott@watershed.charlotte.com, matt@watershed.com. Reach out to us. Any questions you might have, we'd love to be able to have this conversation. Thank you for letting us talk with you this morning.
Thanks.
Is there anyone who ever remembers changing their mind from the paint on a sign? Is there anyone who really recalls ever breaking rank at all, or something someone yelled real loud one time? Oh, everyone believes in how they think it ought to be. Oh, everyone believes, and they're not going easily. Leaf is a beautiful armor, makes for the heaviest sword, like punching underwater. You never can hit who you're trying for. Sunday the exhibition, a map, no try. It's the chemical weapon for the war that's raging on inside. Oh, everyone believes, from emptiness to everything. Oh, everyone believes, no one's going quietly. We're never gonna win the world. We're never gonna stop the war. We're never gonna beat the sick belief is what we're fighting for. Never gonna win the world. We're never gonna stop the war. We're never gonna beat the sick belief is what we're fighting for. Is there anyone who ever remember, never surrender with their life for life? We're never gonna win the world. We're never gonna stop the war. We're never gonna beat the sick belief is what we're fighting for. We're never gonna win the world. We're never gonna stop the war. We're never gonna beat the sick belief is what we're fighting for. What puts 100,000 children in the sand? Leaf king, leaf king. What puts a folded flag inside his mother's hand? A leaf king, a leaf king.
Good morning. My name's Scott. I'm one of the other pastors here, and it's really good to be with you this morning. I take these Sunday mornings even sort of more in more of an honoring way because it's just so good to be in a space with you guys because for the last year it's been so crazy. So, have you ever been on 77 and on Tyvola there where you get off the exit, and if you're kind of leaving the city and you get off the exit and you make a left, and maybe before you go to the shopping centers to the right, or there's a music center or some music store over there and Costco, and on the right-hand side before you go over there, there's this fancy auto dealership. Ever seen that? It's like some Italian name, and it's got all these curvaceous cars in the parking lot, and right, quite beautiful. And so I was over in that region for some reason dropped off Colson or Keen, one of my boys, and I had an hour to kill. And so for 17 years, I've driven by this fancy dealership and have had, of course, no right to ever enter the dealership. But I thought, why not? And so I pull up in my beater pickup truck and I go in. And what always happens the moment you go into a dealership? Somebody comes out and greets you, right? Well, nobody came out to greet me. So I'm walking around and I see these cars. Frankly, I don't really know much about cars. I just can appreciate what the beautiful lines of a car, or the curves, and the way supposedly the leather seats and all those things, of which I've never really been in anything like those cars. And so got these high-end names that of many vehicles I've never been in before. But one of my favorite cars that I fantasize about that I will never have is a Porsche. And so I show up to this space, and I got like 7 of them lined up next to each other. And they're all used. So I'm thinking, well, in my fantasy mind, well, maybe I can afford a used Porsche, right? And so, again, I have no right to walk around the space. Nobody's asking me if I want to do a test drive. They're assuming that I shouldn't be in this space, which I really shouldn't have been. And so I go and look at a used Porsche, and there's like 6 or 7 of them. I'm walking around, and I'm taking them in, and I now have to have reading glasses when I need to see things. So the stickers are on the car where you could apparently see the details and the nuances of that vehicle and the bottom line selling price point. And I lean over, and I look, and I look again, and I'm thinking, man, I don't have my glasses on, but $207,000 for that car. I think, well, clearly I'm never going to own a Porsche. And so I walked around and left and didn't think twice about it, but it just, wow, it was a cool experience. A couple weeks before that, my son Colson and I were up in Concord, and maybe you've been there before. There's this vintage, used consignment car warehouse up there. And all these cars from like the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and 70s, and just people who poured their soul into these cars, and then I guess they're selling them in this space. And so we've been there before. We just walk it because we just take it in. My son is obsessed with cars and horsepower and engines and all these things of which I know nothing about. And so usually when we go, it's very informative. And we walk in, and there at the front door is a 1971-ish Mach 1 Ford Mustang. This thing was beautiful. I mean, it looked like it was in mint condition. Somebody poured tons and tons of time into this thing, and it just, where maybe the Porsches sort of reeked of efficiency and speed and elegance, this had muscle and strength, and you could imagine if that engine were to be turned, that muffler would roar. And it was absolutely breathtaking. And so, of course, we walk these lines of cars just to take it in. Same thing. There's nobody's coming up to me and saying, "Do you want to buy this?" Because I guess we don't look like people that would be able to afford those cars. And so I went up to this car, thinking, well, 50-some years old, maybe I get to fantasize more realistically about this one. $207,000 for a 50-year-old car. And so, again, just in awe of these vehicles, but there's something that we still crave about reaching back into what was, right? What makes that car so valuable is not the steel and the metal, although that clearly adds to it, but it's so often the nostalgia, right? It's what that car means to many of us. It's the memory of seeing that car when we were a kid, or owning that when maybe it was more accessible when we were younger in life. And reaching back and understanding that there's something of consequence about what that car represents. In a weird way, it's sort of like we live in both worlds. We want the new and the sleek and the elegant because it introduces new realities with which we never understood. But there's something about going back to what was. There's something about what that means to us. There is something about the nostalgia of maybe, dare I say, our faith, that we look back at and say, it wasn't all bad. A lot of it was jacked up. A lot of it was haunting. A lot of it was oppressive. But maybe there were parts of it that were deeply meaningful because it was rooted in context. It was rooted in relationship. It seemed like a more innocent day, a more naive way of seeing reality, and it probably was. But nonetheless, there was something about it that was of consequence. There's a couple that walked in a few weeks ago, and they were brand new to this community, and they had showed up with one of you all, a friend of theirs who brought them for the first time. And these people, I could tell they were about my age. They were in their early 50s, and they've been around the block a little bit, and there was this conversation that they were having with me, and we got at it really quickly, where they were speaking of almost this longing for something else. This sense that they gave something up, they let something go, they let the old go, and in doing so, they're trying to find something new, but they're having a difficult time in doing so. That the nostalgia of the past actually was meaningful, but they also knew it was haunting and it wasn't helpful and it was oppressive. And so all they knew was either, it's kind of this binary conversation, either I hold on to the old or I let it go. I think that's been true for so many of us in our journey here. Right? Like we've deconstructed from all the things that we used to hold on to, and in doing so, we've just put it all in sort of in a trash heap and assumed that it's all to be written off as not being ideal, as being unhealthy. And so then we've been pursuing sort of the new, sleek variable, and that kind of makes us feel a little bit wanting because it's not really connected or rooted in something else besides just now and modernity. And so my conversation with this person, they're coming through the door, is I get your concern, like this loss of hope that you had, that you used to hold on to something, and now you've let all of that go, and it feels like it's kind of hopeless right now. It feels sort of weak and anemic, at least the pursuit of the new, modern, and shiny. And I said, well, it does, doesn't it? And I said, I'm here to say, I think there is hope that there's something of consequence that we can reach back into the past, pull it forward, and simultaneously add to it and make it new. I'm pretty convinced that Ford Mustang, that Mach 1, had some new modern variations added to it. The AM radio that was in it, it's no longer an AM radio. I can plug my iPhone into it and have a killer sound system inside. Very modern, right? There's probably some electrical stuff and some new wiring in there and a new exhaust system that's a little bit more modern, that has a little bit better sound to it. There might even be a little computer chip here and there and that. And what have we done? We've combined both worlds. And here at Watershed, I wonder if it isn't much about maybe us combining multiple ways of seeing reality. So in this series, Loose Blocks, we talk about David talked about a few weeks ago about what it means to embrace baptism, or Sean, prayer, or Pete Enns last week. I mean, there's so much that he talked about this, especially here on a Saturday night, that was so rich. And so today, maybe we get to imbibe something that is a little bit different. If I can invite you into a narrative in terms of how we see God. Now, I'm not the first one that's spoken into this. I know if you've been a part of David Roberts' blocks, you've had some conversation here. If you're a fan of Peter Rollins, you've heard some of this from him, maybe Rob Bell a little bit as well. But what I wanted to do is I kind of wanted to bastardize it ever so slightly, if I could this morning, bring it to Watershed, and give you maybe a tool, maybe a narrative, a storyline that might align with where you find yourself. And maybe instead of you walking in here saying, well, there's only one of two ways of seeing my faith journey. Either I embrace all of what was, or I embrace something shiny and new, but actually maybe it's broader than that. Maybe it's not that binary. Maybe it's not that dualistic. So I'm going to take you on it's been my story a little bit. And this is not true for all of you, because I think you will find yourself entering differently here over the next few moments into this narrative that I'm bringing you into, maybe a little bit differently than I did. But for me, this has been my story, and so it might fit for you. And this might be the kind of thing, at the end of the talk, you might be able to say, you know, it's worth taking a picture of that slide, because that slide might be helpful in terms of how you see and how you are able to speak of God in terms of what that looks like. So this morning, what I'd like to do is give you some tools, give you some resources, some assets that help you understand how we speak of God when we speak of God at different times and different circumstances in our life. So it's not just this, well, I don't believe that tone of God anymore, so therefore God no longer exists. No, maybe you don't hold on to that take of God anymore, but maybe there's 3 or 4 or 5 other ways in which we can take on God. And that those ways are so meaningful that we find ourselves moving in and out of them with ease and variance. And that's the beauty of being able to pull something from the old and being able to engage something from the new and mix and meld those worlds simultaneously. So if I can speak of God in 4 different ways this morning, will you let me go down that journey? And I'm going to take you down that journey, which has been, in terms of how I speak of God in these 4 ways, this has been my narrative. And you've probably heard some of this at different times. So for me, the first one, my first sort of chunk of how I saw God was God as super being. And God as a super being for me typically was given the pronoun he. It was much of my upbringing as a child that God as super being is basically a bigger version. God is a bigger version of myself, maybe a more sophisticated version of myself. We talk about God in terms of a bigger and stronger version of who we are, more intense. This is a very binary way of how we see God, right? Because after all, we are imperfect. God is perfect. We are sick or unhealthy. God is whole and is perfect and is not sick, right? We have this sense that we speak very much about God being powerful. That matters to a super being kind of disposition, that God is stronger and greater than us. And therefore, we sing songs to that kind of God, right? We pay homage to that God because, after all, that God is a version of how we see ourselves, that we project into that God, how we see our own reality. Karl Barth talks about this as being something that legitimizes us. So our God is, in essence, a flattering view of ourselves. Especially if you grew up a white male, you understand God in a very literal male way. And you see him in that lens, and you see him as an ideal version of you, a better version of you, a more perfect version of you. After all, if I'm a liberal hippie, then God somehow is a version of that liberal hippiness. That's how I see him. If I am a flag-toting Republican, then after all, God is also a version of that. That in that space, God blesses our bombs and our tanks, right? That's how we see God. We project ourselves onto this form of deity. This is an idea of super being. And if we only have the ability to be in one place at one time, because that's where in our finiteness, God has the ability to be in all places at all times. All right? If we are limited in our knowledge, God is sort of super knowledge, and he in particular knows everything. If water consumes us as we enter into it, a super being can walk on top of it, right? That we take on God as almost like a superhero fashion. That he can fly where only we can walk, right? He can keep bullets at bay when they hurt us and penetrate our bodies. That this God is also a vindictive and punitive God. Because after all, he is living up to how we see reality. It's all about being fair, right? If somebody hurts me, then I'm going to hurt you back. That's called justice, and that's how we see it in a punitive format. That God is a God, this is probably part of the super being God that I held to more than anything, that God was a fix-it God. That he would make things right, that he would fix things when things were broken in my life. That if I was out of resources, he would provide resources. If I was sick, then he'd provide healing. This is very much our ethos and our culture here at Watershed early on. After all, you had a soul that was broken, and we had a God that could fix your soul and save you. And so our goal was to try to introduce you to our God that could fix you. That was very literally the narrative and the metaphor that was Watershed early on. And then we pray to a God for healing because, after all, we're sick. And so that's kind of a good thing. And we also ask God if he can help us maybe win the lottery, right? Because after all, God is this sort of slot machine kind of deity that we throw the quarters in and we pull the slot, and hopefully things live up to our expectations. I remember about 8 or 9 years ago, a friend of Matt's and myself came to town, and we met. He came to town just to visit, and he'd been going through some of this journey himself, and began to speak into this sense that maybe the God that we hold to is a sort of punitive God it's all about 1 + 1 = 2, and everything kind of fits in this nice, neat fashion. And when we need God to fix our needs, he fixes our needs. And by the time this guy had left, some of how I saw that reality, my deconstruction had really begun to kickstart in that moment, in that season. And I remember when he left, all I thought I had left was this sense of an old God that I no longer was able to buy into. And this, not only did I deconstruct away that God, but I also deconstructed away of a God that would fix my needs. And that was a very difficult time. I'm a 6 on the Enneagram. And after all, my relationship with God was very much about God being there for me when I had needs. Because it's a 6 that matters, right? And when I'm not healthy as a 6 on the Enneagram, I go to a place of fear, and I'm going to sort of hoard things, because after all, I got to keep things stable. So God as a super being for most of us is something at least I came from. That was the God that I eradicated from my life, and I didn't think there was any other way of viewing God. It was very sad. It was a very lonely time, I remember. And I remember still being here, attempting to stand up here on a Sunday and speak of this God with some source of value, when fundamentally he in particular, but they maybe more specifically, were not working for me. So for many of us, I think in this place, we've kind of come from this hyper being, the super being place, where the next place is hyper being. And to me, the hyper being conversation, and hold off on the slide if you would back there, please reveal that at the end of it for me, because I'm not sure I'm doing it justice by showing the slide. But the hyper being conversation for me is much more freeing. It's much more about metaphor. It's much more in this tone, and this is very biblical in the sense that God is fire, that God is rain, warrior, mother, father, boat, wind, lamb, lion, right? That these metaphors, and albeit many of them conflicting, are how we often, in the place of God as hyper being, see reality. So we move from this place of super being to hyper being. This is how we describe God in these metaphoric kinds of ways. In some passages in the Bible, God is very controlling. God seems to be almost manipulative. In other passages, God is in essence saying, all right, my humankind that I've created, I will give you the opportunity to literally change my mind. We see a God that controls, and we see a God that literally says, all right, humans, you can speak into the narrative and you can change my mind. We see this kind of metaphorical dance between humankind and God quite a bit in the scriptures. We see the conversation with Moses and God, where Moses is saying, hey, God, here's the deal. I would like to interact with you. I would like to see the front of your reality, your presence. And God says, not a chance. The best you're going to do is see my backside. The best you're going to be able to see. So you have these kinds of metaphors and narratives that are much more sort of squishy and hard to put our heads around fully. There's no one way to interpret God in this place of hyperbeing. I find some energy in this place because I don't have to box God in. That when you sit down and you begin to articulate how you take on God, I'm here to say, okay, that actually is meaningful, and I'm probably going to learn and benefit from your perspective of how you see God. Instead of getting it sometimes, this is what Pete Rollins says, instead of getting it, somehow it gets at you. It doesn't always make sense, but you sense that something beautiful is happening. The mystics understand this in profound ways. They say that God cannot be conceptualized, that God is bigger, better, and different than anything we can say about who or what God is. I believe it's Meister Eckhart that says, I pray God rid me of my idea of God. Every time I think of God, I have an idea of what God might be. At that moment, I have robbed God of his or her identity. That God is greater than anything I can imagine. That's what a God of hyper being, how we see that. That maybe my prayer to God is, God, help rescue me of any idea that I have of you because it gets in the way. We create kingdoms, and God breaks down those kingdoms. We create these ideals, and God breaks those down. That there's no right or wrong. There's no accurate way of perceiving God or inaccurate way of perceiving God, that it's actually freeing. It's more about not who is God as much as I don't want to miss out on potentially what I could experience with this deity. That maybe I get that I don't always get you, God. That you are a mystery to me. Not getting you is sometimes maybe what it's all about, right? So 25 years ago, a friend of mine, and I remember very distinctly, he was into painting. I was not into painting, and I am a horrific painter, and I tried, and it was reflective of that. But he showed me this abstract expressionist, Mark Rothko. Are you guys familiar with Rothko's work? So he's this mid-century, really cool artist, and he did this piece, and it's called the Red Royal in Blue, and I think we got a slide of it where, there you go. So you look at this, and you think, well, my kindergarten kid could do this, right? And I thought the same. So I remember a couple decades ago, I bought some canvases and some paints and some brushes and thought, I can clearly do a Rothko painting. This is no big deal. And I couldn't, obviously. I mean, it's a bunch of squares and rectangles, but there's actually a lot of elegance to it and a lot of beauty to it. This painting right here went for $71 million in 2012, right? It's crazy, right? It's nuts. So art, like we've always said, is in the eye of the beholder, right? To somebody, that's worth over $70 million. And then some of us in the room think, well, I can do that. My kid did that in school. And that thing has value to some people, and to others, it's like, well, no big deal. And what is it we know about art? That when you take it in that moment, it changes how you look at it maybe months later or weeks later, depending on what's going on in your life, right? That's the beauty of art, the beauty of music or poetry. Like when you hear it in different contexts, in different experiences in life, it takes on different form. I wonder if this isn't true how maybe we need to interpret God. That we come to God, and some of us see God more valuable in those circumstances based on our current realities, our current experiences. That God is hyper-being is something very different based on who we are, how we understand and interpret reality, and maybe where we've been born, where we've grown up, the cultures that we've been in. And so that God is almost like this art form. That you can't get it wrong. That if we were to sit around and discuss Rothko's piece from the 50s that went for $70-some million today, that it has different unique meaning to different people, and to maybe most of us in the room it's completely meaningless, but to somebody that's deeply valuable. And that God is hyper-being, has that kind of ebb and flow to it in terms of how we connect with the divine. So we've got God as super being, God as hyper-being. And this third one, we've got God as ground of being. Now, I think this is, like anything, the moment you move off of these like the super being and hyper being, they're more tactical, they're more tangible, they're easier to explain and articulate. The more you move through this, the more sort of esoteric and harder to articulate they become. So I'm going to do my best. So ground of being, and Paul Tillich is a theologian that really does some work on this. If I speak of your human existence, and I say that your breath is the source of your reality, that your breath is what is the ground of your reality, there's a truth to that, right? That if you can't breathe, you can't live. That your breath is everything. That it's the center to who you are. A couple of weeks ago, Austin, during a worship set, invited us into, I believe at the end of the song or the middle of the song, just to take in those moments and breathe. In essence, what he was saying is acknowledge that God is ground of being. The core of who you are is this divine reality. We talk about this in terms of spirit sometimes. We talk about this in terms of Christ. Or maybe universal Christ. It's the glue, like Paul seems to speak of in the New Testament, that holds everything together. It's what John talks about in John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. It's this idea of Word is spirit, or breath, or ruah, that has this sense that all things are grounded in something. For those of you who are yogis, right, in the yoga space, your breath is everything, right? No matter how stressful that pose is, the goal is to try to remain consistency with your breath. No matter how painful it is, right? It's keeping your breath at a certain rhythm. And there's something core to who you are as that yogi in that position, and you're connecting to your breath. You're connecting to your ground of being. You're connecting to your divinity. You're connecting to spirit. You're connecting to the Christ, the universal Christ. And again, like even as I'm explaining, I'm like, I have no idea what I'm talking about right now. It just seems so out there, yet it's this much more fluid way in which we come to the divine. It's this much more elegant way that does not put controlling factors, that does not box God in. And this is hard, because I find myself moving from certainty to ambiguity. And I think people that have a real evolved understanding of the divine, they're really good with ambiguity. You're really good with sort of having a sense of who God is, but not having a clear, defined container. So super being, God is super being, God is hyper being, God is ground of being. And what you might find yourself doing is actually moving kind of in and out of all of these at different times. That to me becomes a much more evolved conversation. That it's not about just living in one of these, that based on your context, your circumstance, who you're talking with, who you're engaging, you might find yourself going back to super being because the person you're talking with, it's all they know. And they're longing for an option outside of super being. And you're like, you know what? I got some other options for you. They're still a little bit out there, but I got some options for you. And then what if, and again, this has been a little bit of my journey, and I find myself moving in and out of these. What if the last container is sort of God as event? Now, again, this is one of those things that as I speak about it, as I attempt to give you a few moments on articulating it, I'm not sure I understand it. But there's seasons that I've found myself bumping into it. It's one of those things, I don't know if we can understand it as much as we know it when we experience it. But if you're thinking of mind, body, or the spirit, flesh binary, that doesn't work. That doesn't work in this space, that God is God of event. If you think of God as event as this essence that loves, then you might be bumping into something a little bit more accurate. That there's this movement, there's this force of love in the universe that cannot be reduced to a two-tier materiality. That's not about soul and body. It's not about out there and down here. It's not about a heaven or a hell. That the world, maybe another way of saying it, that the world is in reaction to itself. So we pay back affliction with affliction. That's the normal, right? That's the norm. That we bring pain. If somebody brings pain onto us, we introduce pain to them. That if somebody wants war with us and somehow attacks us, literally, individually, or as a country, what do? We bring war back onto them. If somebody flies planes into our economic infrastructure and our buildings, what do? We retaliate with a multi-trillion-dollar 20-year war that doesn't work. That's how we operate. It literally is how we as humankind see reality. But God as event crowbars into our reality a different way. And that different way says, instead of maybe retaliating, I'm going to respond with love and grace in that event. I'm going to see things, albeit still flawed and imperfect, maybe a little bit different. Walter Wink speaks of this as a third way. That we typically have these sort of binary ways that, you do this and I respond with this. But Walter Wink says, is there another way in which we can come to this conversation? Are there maybe a third or fourth or fifth way that helps us understand that we can respond to that event with a sense of grace and love? And in that, God somehow makes themselves more realized. And again, I'm really careful as I speak to some of this as though somehow I am an expert, of which I am not. But about a year and a half or so ago, Black Lives Matter happens, and while for some, the response was, I'm going to be reactive to that and oppress that, maybe for the first time in at least modern history, some folks stepped back and said, wait a minute, can we reimagine what's happening here right now? And can we hear what's going on and realize that the conversation is not to be centered around me in these moments, it's about to be centered around my siblings of color. And the moment we did that, we introduced this sense of grace and love and said, there's a different narrative here that needs to be heard. And in that, like, God sort of showed up. In a very real way, you sensed that there was something sacred, something spectacular happening here. And the conversation continues to happen. It continues to happen with tons of imperfection, right? We could even get into the Kyle Rittenhouse acquittal, the Ahmaud Arbery trial this week, all the things that are going on right now that are creating such tension. But the fact that we're realizing that there's a different conversation that needs to happen, it's as though for the first time, at least in our modern era, that God is finding themselves revealed in these moments, in these senses of an event themselves. We see this in the scriptures in terms of the Exodus story. Right? Slaves were liberated. Oppression is lifted. That liberation is the event itself. And that event itself is God. Right? That God shows up in that space. And this is huge for those of us who value the justice conversation. Because God no longer is just this personality out there, but God is the essence behind the event where we're crowbarring into a new reality. This is a big part of the conversation for us. So for some of us, we find ourselves maybe still resting in the super being space, or the hyper being, or the ground of being, or God as event. And what I'm here to say is it possible that as we look at these four, and arguably there's 5 and 6 and 8 and 10, we could have more conversations, but as we look at these four containers, is it possible for us to say we actually find ourselves moving in and out of these based on our current needs and our circumstances and the pain that we're going through and the conversations we're having? And as I look at these, so many observations surface for me. So many of these things that I just never understood before, because for the longest time, super being was the only container they held to. And when I let super being go, I assumed there was no other way of really seeing God. But since there are multiple ways of seeing God, is it possible there's some really powerful observations that can happen in all this? One of them is when my atheist friends come to me and they tell me they're an atheist, that's fine. They're probably an atheist against the God of super being, right? That's what they're anti. And I'm here to say, well, if that's an atheist, then I'm probably one too. Because I'm not sure I buy much of that in my life either. But I find myself saying, well, let's talk hyper being, or let's talk grounded being, let's talk event. All of a sudden, it becomes much broader and much more beautiful. It's not just my closed-in super being disposition. Or when I look at this, and I look at the journey I find myself going on, like that super being to hyper being to grounded being to event, I move from perceived certainty, because that's what we love in our modernity, right? We love to be able to box God in and say, this is how God works. I'm weak, God's strong. I'm imperfect, God's perfect. I can't walk in water, God can walk in water. We have these binaries. And the more we move through this, we find uncertainty actually to be core to the process. That we don't have simple resolves anymore. Doesn't mean we don't have truth. Doesn't mean we don't have truths that we land on for those moments because it's all we know. I think that's where we're finding ourselves these days at Watershed. We are holding truths because it's all we know in these moments. But what we do know is that truth probably will edit over time. And that's the idea of sort of moving through this uncertain space. But in all of it, it's all mental gymnastics if it doesn't translate to something, right? It's all fun cognitive dissonance if it doesn't really sort of move towards how is it that it impacts my life. What you believe, it doesn't really matter until it sort of plays out in the how space, right? That what I believe about generosity. So here's the thing. I am really convinced that eating meat is bad for me. I'm really convinced of it. As a matter of fact, I've watched all the Forks and Spoons and Knives and whatever shows, right? I watch all the documentaries. I know every time I eat a mouthful of meat, I'm taking minutes and seconds off my life. I know that. I know that sugar is highly addictive and it's killing me. And yesterday, I had both, right? So what I believe and how I believe it are two different realities sometimes. So it doesn't matter sometimes what you believe. It's the how we believe that ultimately matters, right? So when we have a take on God that is a God of grace in terms of event, or a God that, as hyper being, is not easily micromanaged and put into a container, but is more like art, that you take on God based on your context and where you find yourself, just like the people around you will take on God in a different way. And you sit with that nuance in all its beauty and all its understanding or lack thereof, that ground of being is a God of mystery. And that as we sit in those spaces, we begin to realize that, wait a minute, I need to maybe not only think differently, but I need to live differently through this space. So here at Watershed, it's something that we're constantly trying to lean into. What does it mean for us to have different conversations about, like the Black Lives Matter conversation for us? A year and a half or so ago, it was as though we were just coming into a space that said, all right, for the first time, we're able to have conversations about this that we never had before, and we began to continue to this day wake up into those spaces. Or in terms of generosity, how you are generous with your resources. What does that look like? You might believe in generosity, but what's that mean in terms of going forward? For some of you who took it very seriously last week and you're helping out a brother Tunglal. Or maybe how you vote. This was a big one for me. Then I began to realize I don't have a vote party. That's crazy to think that any one party would have all the answers. Why would I ever vote party line? And I did it for so many years, but that's ridiculous because no one party has it figured out. So when I vote now, it's all over the map because I'm voting per the person and their ideal as I see it. Or maybe how I treat others, right? Like the idea of my understanding of God informs how I treat my neighbor, treat people around me. So this morning, I invite you into this pursuit, or a pursuit not unlike this, that says, you know what, it's actually freeing to know there are multiple ways in which you can take on faith, or which you can take on God. If you're an atheist, great, no problem. I can talk to you about that, God, but I'm not sure I fall into that container either. And maybe you're like, you're this yogi that's got it all figured out, and like, awesome, take me on that journey. I'm willing to play. I don't know where I'm going, but I'm willing to dance. And maybe there's a fifth and sixth and seventh and eighth container that says, wait a minute, maybe we can expand not only our knowledge and our understanding of God, but more importantly, how we live out our reality based on our worldview of God. You pray with me? So God, not sure if I'm praying to a God of super being or hyper being or grounded being or event or whatever this morning. But the essence that is out there, we do what we do here for community, for a way of living that's better, for an engagement that's more meaningful, for coming around others that maybe don't have resource or infrastructure, and we become that for them. Thank you that this community is courageous enough to really answer and engage these kinds of conversations with integrity and with mystery. Thank you for my friends, my siblings in this room who are struggling in life and yet still are courageous enough to continue the journey, to continue to ask really good questions, to not give up on each other, to not give up on a pursuit of you. And whatever we even mean by our narrative of you-ness, whatever that is, thank you for the discovery. Thank you for the learnings. And so there's a sense that we want to say we love you because we feel maybe that somehow there's a connection to you. That connection is a connection that we have with each other. And that we're grateful for this journey, and we're grateful for this conversation, not only what we believe, but how we live out what we believe. We pray this in the Christ's name. Amen.
One of the spaces that can sometimes be hard, I know it was hard for me to figure out how to engage God maybe in these 4 different ways is with music. And there are a lot of lyrics that point to this super being God that we should praise, and somehow that God would decide whether or not our praise is good enough. There's lots of scripture that points to that, and I think it took a while to figure out how to get outside of that. And what does it mean to engage God as ground of being through music? And so one of the things that helped was to let go of needing it to be right. So that means the lyrics, that they perfectly describe God and describe my pain and describe joy and just encompass the whole thing. And also that the music has to be perfect. And when I stopped trying to make it right, then it became good. And so I invite you this morning to stand if you're willing and able, and maybe try this out. Give yourself permission and space to just be, to give yourself to whatever music makes you feel. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. No, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I find, leaves the 99. I couldn't earn, I don't deserve, still you give yourself away. No, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. So lay down your burdens, lay down your shame, and all who are broken, lift up your face. Oh, wanderer, come home, you're not too far. So lay down your hurt, lay down your heart, come as you are. Let's sing that again. Lay down your burdens, lay down your shame, lay down your burdens. Oh, lay down your shame, and all who are of your face. So wanderer, come home, you're not too far. So lay down your hurt, lay down your heart, come as you are, come as you are. As you are, oh, come as you are. All the earth will shout your praise. Our hearts will cry, these bones will sing. Great are you, Lord. And all the earth will shout your praise. Our hearts will This morning, as we breathe together, we participate in the divine. God, we pray that it changes us, that our beliefs about you, about God, would change what we do, how we live, how we treat others, how we think about ourselves. And God, may this experience reverberate into this week and lead us to love. We thank you. Thank you for community. Thank you for space to work all of this out. We love you. We love each other. And pray all this in your name. Amen. Thank you so much for being here this morning. And remember, we've got a memorial service coming after this. So if you could, please leave the room and have any conversations that you want to have outside. Thank you so much.